Hello, my name is Roisin. I've been making videos on this channel since 2020, but I have been recording my reading since 2019. So that is 5 years of reading recording. And I thought it would be fun to go through my 5-star reads over the past 5 years, whether I still think I would give them 5 stars if I read them now, and what I thought of them at the time, see if I've got more generous or less generous in my 5-star giving out. So I've read 500 books in that time and I have 34 5-stars. Which suggests I am not particularly generous when I give out my 5-star books. Let's begin with the first year, 2019. So in 2019 I read 34 books, which is the smallest number on this list, and I gave 3 books 5 stars out of 34, which is like 9%? 8.8%, so yeah, like 9%. And the other interesting thing about these 3 books is that they are all historical fiction. So the first one is Golden Hill by Francis Spufford, which is set in New York in the 18th century, and it is about a man who has come from no one knows where to New York, and he has a large amount of money and he wants to buy all of the slaves. It's written in a way that is kind of a pastiche or an homage to an 18th century novel. I remember the writing being really great, it being like quite comedic, very immersive in the time period, and it also had quite a lot of violence, and it had twists which really surprised me, which is not something I usually look for in a book. This was a very plotty one, but that's what I remember enjoying about it now. I'm not sure I'd give it 5 stars if I read it now, maybe more like 4, but I'm sure I would still enjoy it because my memories of it are very fond. I also gave 5 stars to The Luminaries by Eleanor Catton, which won the Booker, I think the year before, I think it was 2018, and this is a really chunky historical fiction set in the 19th century in New Zealand during the gold rush, and it is about a body that is found, someone's found dead, someone's gone missing, and there is kind of a mystery as to what happened, and we meet 11 men in a room who are talking about something, discussing this, and it kind of unfurls from there what has happened, told from multiple different perspectives, and they are like long chapters, but then in the second half it gets quicker and quicker as we go into a trial and various things happen. And also it is based around the zodiac, so each of the characters represent a different zodiac sign, and then other members represent like planets and suns and moons and things. I don't really know very much about the zodiac, and that wasn't really necessary because I still really enjoyed the book. Again, I remember it being a very immersive read that built up a lot of atmosphere, and again the mystery element. The mystery element really drew me through this, and I don't think I'm really looking for mystery now in books, but maybe I should be. And the final one from that year is The Mermaid and Mrs. Hancock by Imogen Hermes Gower, which is again set in the 18th century. This time it is about a ship, a merchant whose ship captain brings back a mermaid skeleton, which he then displays as a curiosity and gets brought up by a madman from a brothel, and a courtesan who's kind of down on her luck after her sugar daddy dies and gets brought back into the brothel and their meeting. And what I really remember enjoying about this is the language, the evocation of the 18th century, and kind of the dirtier real life of the 18th century, not kind of a fluffy Marie Antoinette style 18th century. I think again it was quite fun and quite rompy and quite a lot of plot. So, but also I think much more like atmospheric, much more scene building and character focused than a lot of plotty books. I'm pretty sure I remember doing a video where I read 1-star reviews of my favourite books, and they said that nothing happens in it, so I think it's plotty, but other people might disagree. So let's now go on to 2020, the year I started this channel and everyone was trapped indoors, so I think lots of people read more than they had done before. So in 2020 I read 118 books and I gave 12 books 5 stars, which is pretty much 10%, so I'm a little bit higher, I'm a little bit more generous in 2020. So the ones on this list, I have a mixture of things. There's a couple of poetry collections, some non-fiction, some historical fiction, and some literary fiction as well, so a bit more varied. The first one on the list is Black Movie by Danez Smith, who's a very well-beloved poet here on BookTube, and is also, you can listen to some of their spoken word. I will leave one linked in the description if you would like to. This is a collection that revolves around pop culture and the Black experience, Black American experience. I don't remember much about it. I'm really bad at remembering what happens in poetry collections, but I do remember a poem about being a black boy playing with a dinosaur toy, and the idea of black people being in action movies and the chance to be like an action hero, and wanting to see that growing up as a black boy, which I remember really touching me. I think it has moments of like black joy as well as moments of talking about things like brutality and violence. And I obviously really liked it. It really, really moved me, but as I said, not great at remembering poetry collections. And then we have Naomi Klein, This Changes Everything, which is Capitalism versus the Climate. Naomi Klein, I read one of her books for the Big Book Club this year, which was The Shock Doctrine. I will leave the live show linked in the cards above if you want to go check it out. I really do think she's an excellent writer, really great at making her topics accessible and at combining narrative with fact, at like linking together an argument. And as I've said before on this channel, I prefer non-fiction that has a clear viewpoint and doesn't pretend to be objective, and Naomi Klein has that clear viewpoint. And This Changes Everything about the climate, I think, I preferred to The Shock Doctrine. I think that she does a really good job of going to various different places, of looking at the systemic ways it is just not tackled, it's just not dealt with, and it is ignored, and the ways that that is purposeful on behalf of large corporations. And I think, yeah, an excellent, really excellent writer, and one that I think definitely more people should read. The Shadow King by Basil Mengistu was shortlisted for the Booker Prize that year, and it is set in Ethiopia in the 1930s, about a group of guerrilla fighters who are fighting against the Italian invasion, the attempted invasion from Mussolini. We have it from the perspective of a woman who has been enslaved by this group of fighters, but also from the perspective of a Jewish Italian man who is part of the invasion. And I think what really stunned me about this was the writing, the way that it uses light in particular as an element throughout, because we have photography and repeated themes of photographs and of being witness to terrible things, and then also the fighters use light as part of their fighting. It has really, really stunning writing. It's very quite stripped and quite pared back, and the violence is very matter of fact, but I think the images that it uses are just so stunning, and that's why it ended up on this list. Heavy by Casey Lehman, an American memoir, is one I talk about a lot because I talk about how I don't like memoirs, but I do like this book. This book is one of the best written, like most tightly written things I've ever read. The way that themes come back, the way that he repeats images and metaphors throughout the course of his life. It is about his life growing up as a black boy in Jackson, Mississippi, as a fat black boy specifically, and his experience of the intersection of being black and being fat, and his relationship with his mother, who was abusive, who was an academic, and his relationship with the academy and with going into university, being a writer, various different forms of addiction and eating disorder. Like, it is a very vulnerable, very raw book, but I think what makes it so special is the way that he can access that vulnerability and like really go to those places, and at the same time the skill with which he writes it. It always feels so perfectly pitched and so wonderfully moving, definitely will make you cry, but at the same time will just make you marvel at the brilliance of his writing. He's just a stunning writer, really, really stunning. Next I read in 2020 is Bring Up the Bodies by Hilary Mantel. I have a whole review of the Wolf Hall trilogy, which I will leave again linked in the cards above. I talk about it all the time. I absolutely love Wolf Hall. I adore this trilogy. This is the second book, and it is definitely the plottiest. I think it's a shame it's the second one because I think more people would like it. Like, if it was the first one, it might be easier. But I mean, it's 400-year-old history, so there's no real spoilers. It's about Thomas Cromwell and it's basically the three books follow his whole life from childhood till execution, but the second one follows his life from the death of Thomas More up until the death of Anne Boleyn, which take place over a very short period of time, only a few months, and so this one is so pacey. It still has the brilliance of Mantel's being able to build a scene and really immerse you in the Tudor world, but at the same time it has her wit and her humour. It's very funny, and it is so interesting the way it looks at like psychology. It is so tightly from Thomas Cromwell's perspective without being in first person. It's like you're like sat on his shoulder watching over what he is doing and the way that he will slip into dreams and into thoughts, and he will be interrupted in the middle of a thought which will change the narrative. I go and watch the whole review if you want to hear me like gush about it for 15 minutes, because I can just talk about this book forever. She is such a brilliant writer. Another brilliant writer that is very well known to be a brilliant writer, we have If Beale Street Could Talk by James Baldwin. Obviously a very well known book. This is about Fonnie and Tish, a young black couple in the 1960s in New York, who are about to get married when Fonnie, the man, is accused of rape by a Latina immigrant woman, and he is in prison. He has been incarcerated, and we see the ways that this affects both of the families of these two people, the ways that they love, Fonny and Ish love one another and also love their families, and also the woman and her experience. She was raped and her experience of that, but the ways that she is put upon and pressured by the police, by the justice system, to name a specific person. And so it talks about injustice in a really nuanced, interesting way. But it is also a really rhythmic, lyrical book that has wonderful writing and wonderful heart. Another collection of poetry that I really enjoyed is The Handless Maiden by Vicky Fever. Again, as I said, not great at remembering what happened in poetry collections, but this collection does look at different women throughout folklore, and it is quite a bloody, gory look at those women. The Handless Maiden of the title and of the title poem, a woman who has her hands removed. I can't remember why, but it is quite dark and quite difficult to face, and the way that Vicky Fever writes, I feel like it's very visceral and very physical writing, and so it really gets into you, her use of imagery, and I think it is feminist in a way that is more subtle than like a Carol Ann Duffy, who I really don't like, and I really enjoyed this collection, but again, don't remember much about it. Then we have The Mercies by Kieran Millwood Hargrave, which is a piece of historical fiction that everyone on BookTube loved in 2020, and I was no exception. It is set in Norway in the 17th century and is in a remote island called Finnmark off the north coast of Norway, a community where most of the men are killed in a storm when they go fishing, and so the women are having to fend for themselves. And the King of Denmark who currently owns Norway, is currently trying to get rid of witches, and so he sends a man up there to see what is going on. And it has queer relationships, and it's really still and very atmospheric, very slow and cold, and you really feel like you are in this very small town, and there is a sense of impending doom and terror and of like tension. It's a very, very tense book. Tension between the characters, between these two women, but also tension as to this man and what he's going to find out, what he's going to discover, and an underlying feeling of like brutality and darkness. And a non-fiction that I read and really loved this year in 2020 was Inglorious Empire, What the British Did to India by Shashi Tharoor. And this does what it says on the tin. It came out of Shashi Tharoor doing a debate about whether the British owe reparations for colonialism, and Shashi Tharoor focuses in on India because he is an Indian politician and academic. And he, in this book, goes through all of the arguments he heard about what the British did in India being good for India, and he does take them like in good faith, but argues against them so eloquently and so well. He has such a good like ready list of arguments and ways that it is unfair without feeling like he is berating or talking down to anybody. He's like, I understand why you think this, but here is why you are wrong. And also I listened to the audiobook. He has a really great voice. It's a really wonderful to listen to him. You can hear his humour coming through, and I really enjoyed it. As I said, I think it's a powerful, interesting, well-researched look at Empire that is at the same time really super accessible. And the final book I gave 5 stars in 2020 was Summer Lights and Then Comes the Night by Jon Kalman Stephensen, which was translated from the Icelandic by Philip Routen. So this is set in a small community in rural Iceland. Like, Iceland is pretty rural, the whole thing, but this is even more rural Iceland, and it is about this small community. And the way that it is told is over the course of a year, from Arctic summer till Arctic winter, 24 hours of darkness, and then back out again. It's a kind of an interconnected short stories of this small town that get darker and darker as we go towards the middle, and then come back to being lighter as well again. And it looks at small insular communities where everyone is looking at one another, and the kind of underlying darkness in the history of Iceland and like unkindness to difference. It also has elements of whimsy, which I really enjoyed, and elements of kind of almost magical realism, a kind of strange feeling pervading things, like paranormal might just be around a corner, and characters who are kind of eccentric to an extreme, to a caricature almost, but in a way that I found really charming and really wonderful to read. I really enjoyed this book, and it's one I don't think I've not heard many people talk about. So if we go into 2021 now, this was actually the year that I read the most books. I read 144 books, which is actually obscene. I don't know how I managed that, but I only gave 9 books 5 stars that year. So that is 6%, definitely way down, getting much stingier in my 5-star dispersal. than in 2021 than I had been previously. So the 9 books, again, we have some non-fiction, some literary fiction, some historical fiction, and 1 children's book. So one of the books that I gave 5 stars this year, one of the books I talk about all the time again because I really love it, is The Promise by Damon Galgut. This won the Booker in 2021, and I think absolutely deservedly. It is set in South Africa, about a family of white farmers outside of Pretoria who were in the 1980s. When the mother dies, she makes the father promise to give the house that their servant lives to the servant. Go forward through the time period from the 1980s up until fairly recent, going through 4 different time periods where something important happens to that family and something important also happens in South African history, looking at the promises that have been broken, whether it's by this family, the promises that they have broken to the black people around them, or the promises that South Africa has broken post-apartheid. And it is really funny, really darkly funny. Hello, sorry, my camera died, so I went and got some cake. I was saying it is such a direct skewering of South Africa, post-apartheid South Africa, and it is written in such an interesting way. The writing is so engaging and so funny and so readable, but it is also told in 3rd person and in 3rd person in a way where the 3rd person like drifts closer to a character until the point where we cross over into that character's mind, and at that moment of slippage it becomes 2nd person and it talks directly to you, placing you inside this, your culpability as a reader. It's brilliant. I really, really loved it. I think I probably should reread it. Next is Against White Feminism by Rafia Zakaria, and this is a short non-fiction about feminism, specifically a post-colonial feminism that looks not just outside of the white gaze but also outside of the Western gaze. It very much talks about Rafia Zakaria's experience working in the UN and working with various not-for-profits, and her experience as a Pakistani woman relating to particularly white privileged American and British women and their relationship with women from outside of their own perspective, beginning with like suffragettes going on colonialist missions to like civilize people, and the way that mentality still pervades through modern day feminism. It's a really academic text and one that I really enjoyed. It's definitely not a primer. It's really great, really written, really like infuriating. You can feel Zakaria's anger, and I think that works really well. The next one, similarly by Emma Dabiri, I think is more easy and accessible, but I think does go deep in a way that I really enjoyed, and that is Don't Touch My Hair, which is a history of blackness and experience of being black through the perspective of hair. And it talks about Emma Dabiri's own experience growing up in Ireland as a mixed race woman, but also about hair more generally, how it has been related to various aspects of black oppression, whether that was the destruction of culture through slavery and colonialism, or the use of hair as a way to deny people jobs, and also the concept within the black community of colorism and good hair and those relationships, and I think it was really well written, really well laid out, and I think did a good job of being introductory and accessible for people for whom this is a new topic, a new idea, without being simplistic, and willing to go further and like look at different intersections, and also to analyse in a more in-depth way. I think a lot of the time primers can be very much laying just out information for you, but Dabiri doesn't hesitate to go into nuances and to give analysis as well as a more like factual basis. I also gave 5 stars to Normal People by Sally Rooney. Yes, I am a Sally Rooney girl. I really, really enjoyed Normal People, and it's about Connell and Marianne, who are growing up in Ireland around the 2010s, like the early 2010s, and they start a relationship with one another. She is from a wealthy background, he is not, but he is popular and she is not. And then they both go away to university in Dublin, and the way that identity and things shift when they move into a different world, the way popularity is related to class, and the way that class affects our personal relationships, mental health, and of the Celtic Tiger and the crash in Ireland and its effect on older millennials. I really, really just love it, the way that it is written. The sentences run into one another in a way that is the way that Connell and Marianne kind of understand each other. It's not really a love story or a romance, but it is a story about 2 people, and particularly 2 people as representative of a particular time, a particular generation, and particular class interactions in Ireland at this time period. I also loved Sing Unburied Sing by Jesmyn Ward. This is also contemporary literary fiction set in the South, in the United States, about a boy whose father has been in prison, and him and his mother and his younger sister are going to pick him up as he is being released. And they live with his mum's parents, and so we have this intergenerational family and their experience relating to one another or not relating to one another, and how the carceral system and police violence has affected their lives, and also how addiction affects their life. And it has 3 different perspectives in it. So we have the boy, we have his mother, and we have his grandfather, but the grandfather's perspective are from the 1950s when he was in this same prison. And it is so incredibly beautifully written, one of the most beautifully written books I've ever read. I absolutely love it. It made me cry. It is so moving. The relationship between Jojo and his little sister, absolutely stunning. And I definitely need to read more Jessamine Ward. I don't know why I haven't read more Jessamine Ward yet, because I 100% need to. Then we have the children's book that I mentioned is on this list. That is Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. This came to me at the perfect time. It was just exactly the right place, whimsy. It is about the girl who is a hat maker, and she is cursed one day to be an old lady, and so she sets out to make her fortune, because she has always believed she couldn't do this, but now everything has gone wrong anyway, and she ends up in the house of this wizard Howl, a terrible wizard who eats girls' hearts and things, and she discovers the truth or not of that. And it is very funny, very Welsh, like very British in terms of the humour, and in terms of the references, very, very much specifically to Wales. It uses a lot of fairy tale tropes, but in a kind of sidelong way, not in so much in a like that feminist kick-ass changing the narrative way, much more in a amusing, interesting way than that. Like, that way can be fairly boring. I just love the characters, I love the whimsy. I read the occasional bit of a middle grade, and when it's like this, I absolutely love it. And I've read this one several times, which is not something that I normally do. Another chunky one that I absolutely loved was The Old Drift by Namwali Sapel. This is set in Zambia, and it covers 100 years of Zambian history, and then off into the future. Like, it's like historical fiction, contemporary, political, coming of age drama, and then also sci-fi. And I really thought it did such a great job of all of it. There is a Greek chorus of mosquitoes and the pervasiveness of malaria. It talks about colonialism and also neo-colonialism through pharmaceuticals, fight for independence, and the Cold War. It covers so much, but it is very similar to Zadie Smith. I think if you like Zadie Smith, you would like this, the way it talks about class and race and gender, but in such a casual, like, conversational way between characters who are very flawed but very well fleshed out. And I really, really enjoyed it. I didn't enjoy Sapel's next book so much, but I really enjoyed this one, so definitely looking forward to their next one. Another big non-fiction I gave 5 stars was Empire of Pain, the secret history of the Sackler dynasty by Patrick Radden Keefe, which is a really well-researched, really chunky look at the Sackler family, who are the people who created OxyContin, and it looks at their relationship to the opioid crisis and the ways that they used creating scientific journals and their access to doctors in order to prevent themselves and protect themselves from any liability and to promote their drugs by lying, essentially, and also their relationship with the art world, and the way they launder their own reputation through art. Really, really brilliantly written. Angry making, not shocking, not surprising. I like the way that he lays everything out so clearly. And then the final one from 2021 that I gave 5 stars was The Dead Wander in the Desert by Roland Seisenbayev, which was translated from the Kazakh, I believe, by Olga Nakston. It is a Kazakh book, but I think it was written in Kazakh, not Russian. It kind of has a feeling of a Russian epic, with that like broad cast of characters set about a specific time period, rather than a look at a country, rather than a look at individual characters. But it also follows the oral tradition of the Kazakh people in storytelling. It begins with a class who have gone to this dead lake in the desert that has been salinated because of Soviet trapping of the lake in Uzbekistan, and they start telling the story of what happened before, and we follow our hero as he tries to stop this from happening and tries to protect the Kazakh people. And there's also like testing of nuclear facilities nearby that causes cancer and various other illnesses to develop, and it's a really sad story, but a really epic one. And I thought, brilliant, really, really brilliant, but interesting read. If you've ever read any Kazakh literature, which I don't think I've read any other Kazakh literature, I would recommend The Dead Wander in the Desert for sure. So now let's look at last year, 2022. In 2022, I read far fewer books. I read 104 books, but I still gave out 9 5-stars. So that's a much higher percentage. It's 8.5%. So not quite as high as when I'd only read 34 books, but still pretty decent chunk of books that I gave 5 stars. And the first one here is another poetry collection, which is Honorifics by Cynthia Miller, which looks at family and language from the perspective of someone who speaks Mandarin, someone who speaks Mandarin, I believe, and there are use of Chinese characters throughout it, and it'll look at like honour and language and the way that language affects the way that you see the world. Again, as I said, I'm not hugely great at explaining poetry collections, but I really loved this book. Then I also gave 5 stars to Burnt Sugar by Avni Doshi, which is set in India, and it is about a woman and her mother who had taken her to an ashram when she was young and been involved in kind of a cult and left her daughter, kind of neglected her daughter, and they have a very difficult relationship, and now her mother seemingly has Alzheimer's and is losing her memory, and her daughter has to look after her, and it's about how you look after someone when you have such a difficult relationship. And then there's also this idea of memory. The daughter is doing an art project where she draws the same face every day from memory, and it is a look at the way that our memory shifts and changes over time, and the concept of what it is, what is truth, and what we remember. It's a very like strict, disconnected style of writing, but absolutely so moving, and I really loved it. Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield is another one. This one I think made me cry. It definitely moved me quite a lot, and it is about a woman whose wife went on a journey into the sea in a submarine, and has come back and is completely changed. She is now wanting to be in the bath pretty much all day in salt water and disconnected from her wife. And so it is about grieving, but the state of grieving whilst the person is still there, and about loss. And then we also get perspectives from this catabasis, this descent into the underworld of the wife, what happened to make her change. And so there is a dark sense of foreboding, but it's very still, very slow moving. It's classified as horror because there are some like grim body things. There is one specific moment that relates to an eye that I really didn't like. If you watched my live show with Nate from Nathan's Nook when we talked about horror, because we were talking about Our Share of Night, I talked about how eyes and fingernails are the two things that really get me, and this one has an eye thing. That was really creepy. But I still really enjoyed it, and mostly I found it really moving, a really interesting use of body horror and sickness to explore the idea of grief. One that is also really disturbing, but that I gave 5 stars, The Discomfort of Evening by Marieke Lucas Reineveld, which won the International Booker, I think the year before, and it is about a young girl who, at the beginning of the book, loses her brother in a freak ice skating accident, and they live in a kind of isolated community that is very religious in the Netherlands. And there's a lot of like gross things with animals, animal abuse and torture, but also human abuse, and this kind of closed community where there is people watching one another but letting people get away with certain things, because it's considered like a family matter. And it is very dark. It is looking at grief, and our main character is very disconnected and kind of disassociated throughout the course of the novel. She is not in her body and she's not like in her experience, and so a lot of things happen that are beyond the boundaries of what is acceptable, but she is so disconnected, and I just found it shocked me so much. I had such a visceral reaction to it, but I thought it was so powerful and really well done. Another one, similar themes, similar ideas to that, is The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea by Yukio Mishima, and this one is translated from Japanese. It's a Japanese mid-century classic about a group of boys who are kind of roving around their town, who believe that the world is illusory and no one knows the truth, no one's admitting to the truth, and they are the ones who have been able to see it, and they become obsessed with this one sailor who is having a relationship with one of their mothers, but as they come to get to know him, they are disillusioned with him as well. And it is about that feeling of disconnection and of what happens now, particularly in Japan post Second World War, and ideas of like masculinity and what it means to be a man, but also of like childhood and innocence and a loss of childhood innocence. There is one scene with a kitten which is really disgusting, but for the most part I just found it really got under my skin. I really enjoyed it. Again, of course I did. These are all like my 5-star books. We also have Keeping the House by Chichi Chin, and this one I loved so much for the setting. It is set in North London in like the 90s and early 2000s in a Turkish Cypriot community where our main character's partner has gone to jail for being involved in drug smuggling, but he has a load of heroin that he needs to smuggle into the UK, and so she gets involved. And also it is their daughters and their daughters' experience growing up in this community, and it jumps back and forth in time when the daughters are children and when they are teenagers in the early 2000s. And I really love this, the way that it's written, the way that it like intersperses Turkish and uses like bits writing in the margin to explain things. But just the way that it really writes about a London that I really recognise. Like, I'm not from North London, I'm from South London, but it writes a London that feels very real. Like, in the small parks at the bottom of council estates, and in the stairwells of the council estates, and in the corner shops where you call the man behind the counter boss man. It's funny and weird, and I don't think enough people have read it, so read it. Then we have The Betrayed by Riene Akake Melvin, which is set in the Philippines, and I've talked about it a lot on this channel, so you've probably heard about it. It is about two sisters and one of the sisters' husbands, and the two sisters lived in California because their father had been against the Marcos regime in the Philippines and had been assassinated. And then they moved back after the Marcos regime. One of the sisters' husbands, who's the godson of Ferdinand Marcos, is going into politics, and it covers a year in Philippine history where there were so many attempted coups, and there is an attempt to get this election off the ground. Now, one of the sisters who is married to this husband sees ghosts, and she is pregnant as well, and it is about her changing body and her seeing the ghosts of the past, being haunted by the ghosts of the Philippines past. Her sister is in love with the sister's husband, who is not her husband, so their relationship comes into this as well. And we spend a lot of time in Manila, in Manila's political life and Manila's nightlife, and there are a lot of like omens and portents and kind of traditional religion of the Philippines woven into it, as well as the more mystical elements of Catholicism as well. We also travel around the Philippines to various different islands, and there is political violence, political unrest, and a strange, dark, haunting feeling throughout it, which I just loved. The atmosphere is great, the characters are great, the writing is great. I just really, really loved this book. I also loved The Vegetarian by Han Gang, and you can see 2022 seems to be the year of strange, kind of dark novels being the ones that I really loved the most. This is about a woman who decides to give up meat after having had a dream. Her family do not want this to happen, and it kind of becomes an eating disorder, and it's seen as rebelling against the society in which she lives. And it's told from the perspective of her husband, and then her brother-in-law, and then her sister, but never from her own perspective. We see she's very much an objectified character in this, and it talks a lot about sex and gender and consent in some parts of this, and also violence against women. Beautifully written and so stark, and I found it so engaging and so page-turnery. I found the first section difficult to get through because of how heinous the perspective was, but once I was past that, and the style of writing changed from each perspective, and it got stranger and more unwieldy, the more I read this, the more I liked it. It's not a book of likeable characters. There are a lot of terrible people doing terrible things, but I thought the way that it explored the themes and the aims, I thought was just done so well, and I really, really enjoyed it. And then finally, a book that is very different from all of those that I've mentioned so far is My Name is Lucy Barton by Elizabeth Strout, which I read a couple of these books that year, but the first one is the only one I gave 5 stars. I really, really enjoyed it. It's a very short novel about a woman, Lucy Barton, who grew up incredibly poor in the United States, lives in New York and has children, and is moved into a very different class, but her past, the poverty and also the abuse in her family have still stuck with her. And it's told when she is telling a story of the time she was in hospital and her mother came to visit, the only time she came to New York. And then she also flashes back to her childhood. So it is not set in that period. She is constantly telling us a story, and Lucy Barton in this is a writer. And so the idea of subjectivity and of perspective, issue and unreliable narratives comes in. It is a deceptively simple novel. It seems like there is not a lot going on. It seems fairly straightforward, and as if Lucy Barton herself is a fairly straightforward character, but there is a lot under the surface, and I just think it was so warm and welcoming and easy to read, and yet at the same time complex. And finally, we are on to 2023. This seems to have been my least successful reading year if we go by the number of 5 stars that I've had. I've read 100 books so far this year, and I have given out 3 5 stars. 3 5 stars, and they were all at the beginning of the year, February and March. I gave out all my 5 stars. So that is part of the reason I'm actually making this video. I need to find more 5 stars, so please leave in the comments your 5-star books. If you've got this far into the video, which I'm sure not everybody did. But as I said, I've only given out 3 5 stars this year, and if I want to be on par, I need to give out 6 more, so I need to be reading some really good books. Now, in 2022 and 2023, I actually stopped giving out 5 stars. I just reviewed books, but I still put in a star rating on Storygraph because I want to have the statistics, but star ratings are ambiguous. Who knows if something is actually 5 stars, or if some of these 4.5 stars would have been 5 stars at different points in my life. I don't know, and that is something that one of the reasons that I gave them up. I find it difficult to give a star rating, and would rather give you information so that you can tell if a book would be for you, rather than if a book has got somewhere on this arbitrary line for me. There's such a high bar to cross to be given a 5 star. And the only books that have crossed it so far this year is On Beauty by Zadie Smith, which I really, really loved. It is a retelling of Howard's End set in a Ivy League school, in a made-up Ivy League school in New England, about a British art historian and his Floridian wife and their 3 children. At the beginning of the novel, his son Jerome has gone back to England to live with his arch nemesis in the art critic world. Boy falls in love with the daughter and says he's going to get engaged to her. Arch nemesis of our main character ends up going to the same at university, and so their interactions continue. It follows Zadie Smith's usual themes of race and class and gender and art and what can art do, and it is her usual witty, funny style, her usual incisive, brilliant characters who are incredibly well developed but incredibly flawed, as I said earlier about another book I compared to her, and I just really, really loved it. Another great writer that I really loved was Barbara Kingsolver, who wrote Demon Copperhead, which I listened to the audiobook of this year and fell for completely. It is so voicey. It's told from the perspective of this character, Demon Copperhead, and it is also a retelling of a classic. It is a retelling of David Copperfield, but this transplanted from London in the 19th century to Appalachia in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. We follow his life and the various terrible things that happen to him through abuse, through death, through the opioid crisis, the ways that race and class are used to set people against one another, and the moneyed interests, and particularly in the pharmaceutical companies. It does have moments of joy and love, of Demon finding people who are his people, who will support him, of learning about his history and his place. Really warm and wonderful characters that you really, really fall for. I just loved the voice of it, I loved the writing of it. I thought it was so expansive and gorgeous and so well written, and I'm glad I listened to the audiobook because he has such a specific cadence, such a specific place, a voice from Appalachia. And then the final book I gave 5 stars this year, I am very biased about. It's Rebel Bodies by Sarah Graham, who is a good friend of mine, but I don't think I gave it 5 stars because of that. I was actually worried about reading it because I thought, what if I don't like it? It's quite hard to talk to your friend and say, I thought your book was just okay, but it wasn't just okay, it was brilliant. It is about the gender health gap. It's told in various different sections, from menopause to mental health to cancer, talking about the gender differences, and Sarah interviews researchers and medical professionals and patients and activists from various different walks of life about all of these different things, and I think she does such a good job of integrating them together, of writing in such a fluid, well-formed way with really clear arguments, a really clear perspective, which, as I said, is what I really like in non-fiction, and she also gives such a large voice to trans and non-binary individuals and the experience of their experience of the gender health gap, and also the ways that race and class intersect with gender and health in the British healthcare system, and she looks at it from various different perspectives, not just OB-GYN health, but mental health, as I said, and cancer and disability in general, disability justice, and I think it's a really great political book dealing with health and gender, and I think it's wonderful, and that more people should read it. It's brilliant. You should go out and buy my friend Sarah's book right now. There are some books I have not yet rated that I've read this year I didn't want to include in this video because they might be coming out in a future video, so I might already be a little further on than 3, but I definitely am not anywhere near 9 yet, and I kind of want to get to 9 since it would be nice for the last 3 years to have had the same number. I definitely want it to be for more than 3% of my reads to have been books that I think are brilliant. So let me know your favourite 5 stars in the comments down below. Let me know how you feel about star ratings. I didn't say this up top, but I don't really rate books 5 stars anymore, or stars in general. I hope that you have found something interesting here, maybe a recommendation for you. I've tried to be succinct, so I hope I have managed. Thank you for watching. Please remember to give this video a thumbs up and to subscribe if you haven't already. I will see you again very soon. I put out new videos twice a week. That's everything? That's everything. Bye.